Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and we're so grateful that you could join us today. Over the next 2 hours, we're going to cover a lot of different topics. First of all, we'll talk about whether or not we should keep the schools open. And again, it is pretty rare when Anthony Fauci, the Secretary of Education, and the National Review, as the editors say, all agree on one thing, and that is the schools should stay open. By the way, even though the Chicago schools are closing down, the mayor of Chicago is committed to keeping the schools open. So we'll get into that for a little brief comment or two. And of course, that will also lead us into a few comments about COVID. And if you've been keeping score, and from time to time I like to do this, if you compare yesterday, which was January 4th, 2022 to 2021, we had round numbers about 340 more deaths yesterday than we did this time a year ago. But the more striking number is that we had about 630,000 more cases than we did a year ago. So it illustrates something we have talked about before, and that is Omicron may not be as deadly, but it certainly is more contagious. And again, these numbers are within the range of course, what you might call the issue of error. But nevertheless, the death rate still is more than 2,000 a day. And I think if you'd ask the average person out there, they would not know that. Certainly wouldn't have not known that 2 weeks ago when we were still talking about that, because I think the feeling was, well, we don't want to talk about it, and we certainly don't want to say anything that might cause people to be even more discouraged about the Biden presidency, but there you go. Much of what we're going to say today, apart from this, though, will be about elections in the broadest sense of the word. One, because we do have, of course, the January 6th commission, which has already been meeting for some time and is probably going to use the date tomorrow for all sorts of statements that are being made. But again, if you are convinced that we need to do some things to prevent what happened a year ago, obviously, they should be focused on protection, police force, all those kinds of things. But there's a bigger issue, and it's illustrated by the second article I've posted, and that has to do with what is called the Electoral Count Act. Now, again, that may sound a little bit abstract, arcane, difficult to understand. I was going to post the one by David French, which really is sort of that way. He, by his own admission, sometimes is a little bit of a policy geek. But there is a very good piece that we have posted by our friends at the Wall Street Journal that explains how we can maybe adjust some things that may make the issue of certifying an election, say, 3 years from now, a whole lot less contentious than it was last year. So we'll get into that. Also, one of the other articles I've posted here is a review of a book that I really want to talk about in the future, and it's entitled Our Broken Elections, How the Left Changed the Way You Vote. This has been out for a little while, but I thought would be worth getting into with both Hans von Spakovsky and John Fund, but it's a good kind of overview, and we'll probably have them on in the future. And while we're talking about elections, you would think all of this would be over. This is a year later, but guess what? Our friends in Georgia know this, but I want to say this to the rest of our country. Georgia today opened an investigation into the issue of ballot harvesting. They're looking primarily at the U.S. Senate runoffs. But again, if some of the things happened on January 6th, some of the questions about the election hadn't happened, I think it is doubtful that you would have two Democratic senators right now, and you would not have had some of the issues where you are even having the threat that came down just the other day by the Senate Majority Leader, who actually was making the argument that indeed Chuck Schumer is making the fact that we should actually call for a rejection of the filibuster. But I will point out a little bit later, there are two individuals that are on the Democratic side of the aisle, Kirsten Sinema and, of course, Joe Manchin, that said, no, we will not go along with that. And so there was no vote today, as had been promised, on trying to eliminate the filibuster in the United States Senate. So anyway, we've got quite a bit to talk about, and elections will be front and center. And you might be saying, well, we had the election. That's in the rearview mirror. Well, look in your front windshield. You will notice that right now campaigns are underway. Matter of fact, next week I'm speaking on behalf of a candidate around town here, and there are going to be some very contentious primary elections. Not only that, but of course we've had some real challenges about gerrymandering, which I may get to a little bit later. All that to be said, we will try to cover all of that in the first hour. Maybe we won't get all of it in, so maybe we'll postpone some of that till tomorrow. And then we will spend the second hour, as I announced yesterday, with Dr. Craig Keener on his book, Miracles Today. You might remember that we have done some conversations about miracles in the past. In particular, Lee Strobel had a very good book on the case for miracles, and one of the people he interviewed was Craig Keener. Well, years ago, Craig Keener wrote a very good book on the subject of miracles, was very well received an award from Christianity Today. And after that interview with Lee Strobel, he said, should I revise my book? Because we have so much more than I had when I wrote the book initially. He was able to get a grant, I think it was from the Carl F. H. Henry Fund, and then took a leave of absence and wrote this book, which includes a lot that was in his previous book, but it is packed full not only of some of the philosophical issues, how we can even think about miracles in the 21st century, and then lots of stories of miracles in the 21st century. So I think you'll appreciate that in the next hour as well. Let me try to cover this fairly quickly. The article that I have as the first article comes from our friends at the National Review, and as they point out, not too often that you get the head of infectious diseases, the Secretary of Education, National Review, and even the mayor of Chicago all agreeing on one thing. We should not be canceling schools on account of COVID. Yes, I just mentioned that the case level is up, but as they point out, not so long ago, in-person K through 12 instruction would have been redundant. Everyone understood that going to school, sitting in classrooms, eating lunch with friends, and playing outside at races were important parts of childhood development. But then, of course, we have the pandemic, and come March 2020, a lot of schools said, we've got to go online, and they did. But even Anthony Fauci, they point out, with his low tolerance for COVID risk, has come around to the position and said, quote, the other day on George Stephanopoulos' program on Sunday, if you look at the safety of children with regard to infection, we have most of the teachers, an overwhelming majority of them are vaccinated. He says it's safe enough to get these kids back to school, balanced against some of the deleterious effects of keeping them out. And that is something I will talk about when we come back from the break, because always, whenever you talk about risk, it's a balancing issue. How many times have we said, sure, we could require that the nationwide speed limit is 30 miles an hour. It would for sure reduce the number of automobile fatalities. But we also recognize the impact of reducing the speed limit to 30 miles an hour would have on the country. And so there is, I think, a general resignation that it's probably better to have kids in school than out of them. Nevertheless, the Chicago teachers all voted to go online. And we'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
More than a decade ago, Vanderbilt University issued an ultimatum to religious student groups that they must affirm the students' non-discrimination policy. The Christian group on campus believed that the leaders should share the religious beliefs and values of the religious organization. So David French, who was a religious liberties litigator at the time, wanted to help the organization. But the leader, Tish Harrison Warren, felt that a Christian conservative lawyer like him, who was also an Iraq War veteran, was the wrong person to make the case. Instead, she concluded that she was an acceptable kind of evangelical. She wasn't a fundamentalist and liberal in many of her views. Well, she found out how wrong she was. In her article, in Christianity Today, she realized that inside the church, the territory between, say, conservative Christians and more liberal Christians seems vast. But she found out that subscribers to broad Christian orthodoxy occupy the same square foot of cultural space. Why do I tell the story? I found that many young Christians think that if they are just liberal enough, the world will accept them. They tell themselves they aren't like those other Christians, they're the right kind of Christians. As I often say on radio, you never can be woke enough. Just consider the plight of so many liberals who are currently being criticized by the left. There is British author J.K. Rowling. There is George Washington law professor Jonathan Turley. There are comedians like Bill Maher and David Chappelle. Leftist critics scorn and ridicule upon them and post lots of angry tweets directed at them. I believe these young people are fooling themselves by thinking that they would be accepted for being the right kind of Christian. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we're going to talk about schools for just a couple more minutes, and then we'll get into all the election issues, of which there are many. Some of that surfacing from this January 6th commission, some of it having nothing to do with the commission, which, frankly, I wish they would focus on, because I think that is part of the issue, but we will get into that in just a few minutes. But again, our first article, you can read it. It is by the editors of the National Review, and they're pointing out the fact that whenever we deal with risks, and especially talking about potential risks to our children, it is always going to be a little bit of a balancing act. They said throughout the pandemic, there has been a whole lot of balancing going on with pronouncements of public health officials. Anthony Fauci should have been talking like this a while ago, but nevertheless, it's good to hear him say it. We don't need to be convinced of the merits of his position, but perhaps the people who still hold him in high regard would be persuaded if advocacy for school openings comes from him. They're going on some very important facts. Children are at extremely low risk for COVID. In 2020, 2021, 678 people aged 0 to 17 died from COVID. To put that in perspective, 1,161 people in that age cohort died from influenza in that particular period of time of 2012 to 2013, 803 in 2014, 2015. Again, these are numbers that are much higher, but again, because they are just sort of sad footnotes in public health statistics, people don't pay
attention to them. They go on to then say COVID is more severe than flu for adults, but it is not significantly different from flu for children. The adults have multiple safe and effective vaccines and now antiviral pills, which we talked about just the other day. And we don't close schools for influenza. We shouldn't close schools for COVID. And so then it goes on to talk about the teachers union, but I think I'm going to jump to another article that gives you the numbers and helps you understand that even in the midst of this, even when you have the head of infectious diseases, the Secretary of Education, and let's give credit where credit is due, the mayor of Chicago saying schools should be open. The Chicago public schools today are not. And this comes from Carolyn Downey. Chicago public schools will cancel in-person classes Wednesday in anticipation of the Chicago Teachers Union voting on Tuesday to strike against in-person schooling and conduct remote education until the Omicron spike subsides. So the vote was really not so much on whether we'll be in school. The question was whether we're going to go on strike. And the governing body of the Chicago Teachers Union is called the House of Delegates. They voted 555 to 77. In other words, 88%, almost 90% of the teachers said, you know what, we are not going to school. We will propose remote work action until January 18th or until the virus infection rate hits below the threshold level set last year. And so that is one of the reasons why even before the vote was taken, which was sort of a foregone conclusion, that they do not have in-student and in-person classes today in Chicago. Now, I just use Chicago as an example because it's one of the largest school districts that have done it. But I suspect if we were to hopscotch around the country, we'd find some other examples of that. And even in situations where the classes are being held, talking about hybrid systems, parents being interviewed today by the local news media about how fearful they are and the rest. And so, nevertheless, they canceled the schools, but we'll keep the schools open for students, but we'll see how many show up. And on Monday, again, giving credit where credit is due, Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot says she's committed to keeping schools open for the sake of students whose education and mental health have already been severely disrupted for nearly 2 years of virtual schooling. She said the district is prepared to face the uptick in cases. Here's some quotes from her. What we have learned from this pandemic is that schools are the safest place for students to be. We spent over $100 million to put mitigations in place. Most of these staff are vaccinated, and we generally see little transmission in school settings. She went on to say, keeping kids safely in school where they can learn and thrive is what we should all be focused on. I can give you more, but I think you already know the bottom line, and that is if you have seen any of my commentaries, or let's give credit to Penna Dexter, she's written some commentaries as well. There is study after study after study coming down talking about the deleterious effects of taking kids out of school and all sorts of issues that have surfaced. Certain things are on the way up, certain things are on the way down. Things are on the way up, certainly the issue of child nutrition. Some of the kids actually receive the best food for the day in the schools, and the attempts to try to distribute that to kids that aren't in school has been only a limited success. And of course, all sorts of other things have gone up: anxiety, depression, also abuse, because again, we sometimes can pick up examples of abuse because a teacher or a nurse, school nurse, sees that. Those are all on the way up. What's on the way down? Well, everything from literacy to a child's confidence and social skills and the rest. We can go through the long list, but I suspect you know it better than I do. And it's one of the reasons why, for the first time, after now this very disastrous experiment that has gone on for 2 years, we finally have even, and I do underscore the word even, Dr. Anthony Fauci to say, you know what, probably better to have kids in schools Even the mayor of Chicago saying that probably the safest place for some of these students is in the schools, and I would certainly agree. So that's the first article there. It is available to you in case you are dealing with something like this in your own school district. You know, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about this idea of lighting lamps, and we certainly want to give you information so that if there's some darkness in some corner, you can light it up with some of the kind of news, information, commentary, facts, figures, and statistics. And you may be right now dealing with a school district that's having a real debate about whether or not to have in-person education or go back to online learning. And we've given you quite a bit of information. And this first article is a good illustration of the fact that people that have been fairly risk averse, and that would certainly be a lot of people in the Biden administration, certainly would be a number of elected officials, mayors, and school board members and others, are all pretty much agreeing that probably the safest place for kids right now is back in school. Unfortunately, they have such significant limits in terms of some of the learning, as we've pointed out before, that educational gap has become even more significant. In one of my more recent columns, I pointed out the fact that the best and most motivated students, they probably did okay. They were maybe a little more motivated to pay attention to what was on the screen. They might have had two parents encouraging them, parents maybe helping them with some of their educational deficits. And so those kids probably did pretty well. But when you looked at those who had a situation in which they had one parent who had to work or certainly could not help them, they didn't have good internet access, they didn't, and maybe they even had difficulty even paying attention in a classroom with ADHD, even more difficulty paying attention to a screen, they're the ones that were hurt the most. And we also found that, again, this educational gap has increased dramatically. Those who were in middle income or high income families tended to do a little better in the subsequent educational testing, but those who actually were either below the poverty line on food stamps, came in from minority neighborhoods, they were doing perhaps the worst. And so at a time when we want to bring everyone along, no child left behind, remember that phrase? Well, we're leaving some of them behind. And so there's some real good reasons why having kids in the schools and why we wanted to give you some of that information. If you might yourself saying, well, okay, you've given me one of the articles, but where do I find the others? Scroll down to the bottom of our website, pointofview.net, and then there's a search engine there, and you can type in schools, online education, whatever. You will be amazed at how many various articles we've posted, as well as a number of commentaries by myself and by Penna Dexter, and they're all there for you to use effectively. We come back from the break, though, I want to move to the issue of elections. We'll move from education to elections, the other E. And again, we have the anniversary of the January 6th Capitol riots tomorrow. And certainly there are some issues that need to be addressed in terms of security and safety. But I'm going to argue that one of the things that even allowed for some of that to take place goes all the way back to a piece of legislation that was passed in 1887, which should tell you right off the bat that it probably needs to be updated. And it was put into place because of the disputed election of 1876, which, by the way, I've written a commentary about. If we can make those changes, I do believe that it's one more way in which the future possibility of a January 6th kind of Capitol riot would not take place. And I'll explain that right after these messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we were talking about education. Now we're going to talk about elections, probably for the rest of our hour here. And next hour, we'll have Dr. Craig Keener with us. Miracles Today, the supernatural work of God in the modern world. And he wrote a long time ago a very good book on miracles and pointed out that many of the things that you saw in the book of Acts have been reported even in the modern world. And we'll get into that because this is a newer version of the book, a much more readable book. Not that the other one wasn't. He's just a great communicator. But anyway, I just thought I would mention that we will be talking about miracles next hour. And I believe we've also got J.P. Moreland scheduled for one in about a week. So again, if you didn't get your fill of miracles at the end of next hour, well, we have one more coming because there are some just incredible books written by people we have such respect for writing about miracles. Lee Strobel was the first one, Craig Keener the next, and then J.P. Moreland. So anyway, let's get back to this issue of elections. And if you want to take some notes, you can understand very quickly why many people think that there is a possible solution to some of the problems that surfaced last January 6th, because there was an attempt to use what was called the Electoral Count Act in a way to subvert or to begin to decertify the election. In some cases, I think the proponents recognized that it might not necessarily result in Donald Trump sitting in office, although maybe there were some that hoped that, but there were certainly those who believed that it would completely disrupt the certification of what had happened in the various state legislatures during the time. Again, just for the benefit of those of you who would like to know more about this, again, it's our second article from the Wall Street Journal, but I'm reading right now from a piece by David French. David French has been on the program. I didn't post this one because it is long and tedious, and in just a minute I'll explain why posting this one probably put everybody to sleep. I love him, but, he, by his own definition, is a policy wonk. And the Electoral College Act was, again, implemented in 1887. There was a disputed election in 1876. And if you want to know more about that, it was an interesting election, by the way. I have written about that, and you can also do that search. Well, here's a good example of David French. He actually gives you a paragraph of this particular election particular piece of which is referred to as the Election Count Act. It goes on, it's just one paragraph, for 809 words. Okay, so I just knew I was not going to read that on the air. And it's just, again, an illustration of how technical and tedious it was. But because it exists, there was an attempt to engage in what people called the Green Bay Sweep. We now know about this because an individual who was actually part of the team putting this together on behalf of Donald Trump, Peter Navarro, even talked about the fact that there was a twofold idea in this so-called Green Bay Sweep. One was to provide a public forum where the grievances that people had about the election irregularities, of which there were, to be aired. And then second was to have a mechanism by which it would actually then send those votes back to the states for further review. So the goal was not to have a decision made on January 6th, but to disrupt it entirely. Now, bottom line is a lot of the individuals said that this was completely disrupted because of the January 6th violence. But you can go back to first principles and say, we might not have had that if there hadn't been people that were convinced that by decertifying this, you could force it back to the states. And the states were, of course, Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Nevada. And I guess it came to be known as the Green Bay Sweep because it was talking about Wisconsin. But nevertheless, that did not happen. But it was initiated by, of course, Representative Paul Gosar, as well as Texas Senator Ted Cruz. And so here is a piece of legislation that has been around entirely too long, which as a result led to the kind of conflict that unfolded. And so you can see that what was an attempt at that time to derail the process was made very easy because in the law itself, and we talked about this on the air before January 6th, if you could have just one member of the House of Representatives and one member of the U.S. Senate to object, that would be enough to then go through this long and tedious process, which they were hoping would eventually decertify the election. One of the things that people have suggested, and I think it makes some sense, is can we maybe at least have a majority of the House or the Senate to object before we go through this long process? And you have to understand that in the 19th century, we had a lot of corruption that took place. And if you look at various state constitutions written during that time, there was an attempt to go out of their way to make it possible for even one honest person to object to some of the corruption taking place. The problem with that is if you've ever been to a precinct meeting, if you've ever been to a senatorial meeting, if you've ever been to a state convention, and I've done all of those, or if you've ever been even to a city council meeting, you can recognize that sometimes just one individual can manipulate, for example, Robert's Rules of Order, or in this case, the policies put together in the Electoral Count Act, to completely disrupt everything. The reason this was put in there in the first place is if indeed you had some state where there really was just obvious, blatant corruption, and yet one group of electors sent those electors with their vote to the House of Representatives to actually be voted on in January 6th. And others said, no, those shouldn't even be the electors, should be sent. Another set would be sent. Then you could at least have an agreement on the part of at least a majority of the House or a majority of the Senate or both to say, okay, we do have a very significant dispute because we have two different groups of electors who actually should be considered. But when you allow just one person to make the decision and one person to disrupt all of this, you can see that it wasn't going to go anywhere. Back to my second article, you can read it in its entirety, but they point out that the attempt leading up to the January 6th was the idea that we can actually get enough individuals to come along with us so that we would force these particular votes to go back to the state legislatures. In the second page, they said, look, the effort wasn't close to succeeding. There were only 8 senators objecting to the results in any of the states, though there were 139 Republicans in the House that did. No senators voted to object to enough states to deprive President Biden of the 270 electoral votes he needed to win. And so there have been people that have accused, the Vice President, Mike Pence, and others to have ruled against this, but you did not have even close to a majority either in the House or the Senate. And so many people have been saying it is time to begin to rethink this whole issue of the Electoral Count Act. I mean, we so often recognize that something that might have been written in the 19th century as a result, in this case, of a spoiled election in 1876 of the Hayes-Tilden election was maybe done hastily. It, as I point out, has one paragraph that runs to 109 words. I mean, obviously, this is not well written and has very ambiguous language. And our friends at the Wall Street Journal have said, we first endorsed repealing the Electoral Count Act back in January 27th of last year, and we're happy to see others on the right who have followed this as well. And even some on the left, they quote, for example, Politico has noticed this. And so they're saying that right now, Democrats run both houses of Congress. They're in the best position to put the Electoral Count Act on the agenda. And as a result, maybe we can bring about some kind of change. If indeed Democrats do not do this over the next couple of months, and we're going to follow this, then I think you have a very good argument for why you would hope that you would have a Republican-controlled House this time next year, which I think is at least somewhat likely, and that they might push through something of that nature. I don't expect the January 6th Commission to even point to this, but I am convinced that if we really want to address what was unfolding January 6th, we need to go back to something that was passed in the 19th century and needs to either be eliminated or substantially revised, and doing it now, 3 years before the next time this might happen, seems like a good time to get started with that. Anyway, that's a little bit on the election, and we will certainly be talking tomorrow about the January 6th Commission and the anniversary. When we come back from the break, can we do some other things to make the vote more secure? And that's our third article we've posted on the website. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and in the next hour, we're going to talk about the subject of miracles. And by the way, if you think, why are we bringing that up? It seems like that's kind of a theme right now. We mentioned, of course, Lee Strobel being on the program with us, talking about the case for miracles. We'll be talking about, of course, Craig Keener's book, Miracles Today. But even yesterday, our good friend John Stonestreet, who was on with us last week when we were coming to year end, his Breakpoint commentary yesterday was on on miracles. Actually, what he was doing is quoting from a book we'll talk about in about a week by J.P. Moreland, A Simple Guide to Experience Miracles, Instruction and Inspiration for Living Supernaturally in Christ. So it is amazing. A lot of people talking about miracles right now. I owe all of that, I guess, to my producers, sensing we're in kind of a miracles realm right now. Everybody's talking about miracles, and so are we here on Point of View. Just before we take a break, let me mention our third article. This is by Todd Carney. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School and isn't necessarily looking at issues from a conservative point of view, a Christian point of view. He's not hostile to it, but he points out that as he has been looking around, he says that there are some really good comments being made about what we can actually do to address election irregularities. And he says in the second paragraph that these realities raise questions about how our elections should be run and the impact of different election policies on the national and state level. Hans von Spakovsky and John Funn's book, Our Broken Elections, How the Left Changed the Way You Vote, seeks to answer these questions by providing a comprehensive overview of elections in the United States, discussing potential ways to fix them, and warning about the risk of new election policies that could do more harm than good. He has to issue this disclaimer. He said, now these authors are admittedly conservative, but they do an admirable job of cutting through the rhetoric of both sides. They reject right-wing conspiracy theories. He goes through the long list of people that have been engaged in that. They are rightfully questioning and disprove some of the left's election-related arguments, and as a result, point out that Fund and von Spakovsky have a strong hold on history. Arguments about election fraud predate, as he points out, 2020, 2016. The book discusses in detail, for example, the 1997 Miami mayoral election where widespread absentee ballot fraud altered the results. The Miami Herald won a Pulitzer Prize for its reporting on that. They avoid mudslinging, he points out as well. And he also points out that they do spend some time not claiming that all of the issues of election fraud are due to Democrats. There's a section in which they actually, for example, talk about Republicans cheating elections, and as a result point out that that was due in part again to some of the abuses of absentee voting. And so the point they're making is it doesn't matter whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, a liberal or a conservative or an independent or whatever you might be. The point that they are making here is that this is not a partisan issue. It's about election integrity. In implementing some of these attempts, which right now you have being at least proposed in the United States Senate by Chuck Schumer, which is one of the reasons why he said, if you don't vote for this election particular piece of legislation, which we've encouraged you to contact your two senators about, we will actually eliminate the filibuster. Well, that didn't get very far because you had, of course, everybody from Joe Manchin to Kyrsten Sinema saying, we're not going to vote to eliminate the filibuster. So that's an idle threat for sure. But the point they're making is if you actually start getting rid of voter ID laws, if you are not interested in updating the voter rolls, if you aren't interested in preventing state officials from circumventing election laws, you're going to have the same kinds of controversial elections that we've had in the past. And as I pointed out, if you get a copy of my booklet on election fraud, I went out of my way to only give you examples of election fraud and election irregularities that happened on the Democratic side, because I wanted people to understand that even people that are Democrats, as we talked about last week, find themselves saying, you know what, we need to have election integrity laws because otherwise we aren't even getting fair elections in the Democratic primaries. And so those are some examples that are being used. And if nothing else, I did want you to see this, I think, very fair review of this book called Our Broken Elections, How the Left Changed the Way You Vote by Todd Carney, which which appeared actually in Real Clear Public Affairs. And even though he isn't necessarily agreeing with some of their maybe conservative views of these individuals, think they've done a very good job of elucidating and illustrating and warning about some of the dangers that are going to come if we try to loosen some of these election laws. And as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, some of our listeners in Georgia already familiar with the fact that the Secretary of State there in Georgia is going back and looking at the possibility that you had ballot harvesting, which for our listeners in California go, well, we have that there. Yes, but you don't have it in Georgia. So this would be, under Georgia law, illegal for a third party to pick up and drop off ballots. And you have quite a number of these. The best numbers that they're using right now are something on the order of at least 242 people they've identified who made over 5,000 ballot drop-offs in the Georgia Senate runoff elections. And you can see why that would be a source of some concern. So we'll keep paying attention to the issue of elections. And if you keep listening to Point of View, we'll keep telling you what we learn as time goes on. But this third article, a very good piece that you can learn a little bit more about our broken elections. And if you want to read the book, you can do so. Matter of fact, you can read ahead because I'm sure we'll probably get one of those two or maybe both of those individuals on the program in the future. Just before we wind it down for this hour and go and talk about miracles next hour, I did post a fourth article. It's by our good friend Dennis Prager. He's been with us by phone. He's been with us in studio. And it's basically saying that America is still a beacon of liberty. And the point he's making is that sometimes when people say we're losing our liberty in America, okay, I agree with that. There are some real challenges on the horizon. I agree with that too. Well, where would you go? And so he then takes you through most of the major Western countries and points out that if you think it's bad here, it's worse in, and here's the list, Canada, Europe. Then he goes into some of those in Europe, like the Netherlands and France and Austria. Then he takes you to Australia and New Zealand, and then finishes off by mentioning just a few more, like Germany and the United Kingdom, and brings us back to the United States. And when you look at the rather draconian regulations that have been implemented, I'm amazed at, for example, what is happening in Canada, and also amazed at what's happening in Australia. These are countries like us, but in many cases certainly have, I think we could all honestly say, completely overreacted to the pandemic. And then we see what has happened in some of the European countries. It's still a beacon of liberty. Maybe not be in the future if we don't get involved in these elections and stand up for our rights and our liberty, but it's just a reminder of that. And Michael Medved lots of times would start his program by saying, America, the greatest nation on God's green earth, and then he'd have people come up to him and say, do you still agree with that? And his answer was kind of like Dennis Prager, can you think of one that is better? And we're still very privileged in America to live in this country, and we should stand for liberty and recognize some of the things happen in other countries should be a warning of what should not happen in this country. So it's our fourth article, America's a Beacon of Liberty. I could read all the way through it, but I'll leave that to you and maybe make you feel a little bit better about living in this country, although we certainly have challenges in 2022. Let's take a break, though. Dr. Craig Keener is going to be with us. We're going to talk about miracles, and I think it will be an encouragement to you. So stay tuned. We'll have more right after this.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? Pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Our topic this hour is miracles. It is a topic we come back to from time to time. You might remember when we had Lee Strobel in studio with us and we talked about the case for miracles. I certainly want to also mention the fact that even yesterday on Breakpoint, our friend John Stonestreet talked about miracles because he was quoting from a book by J.P. Moreland, A Simple Guide to Experience Miracles, Instruction and Inspiration for Living Supernaturally in Christ. And by the way, we will have J.P. Moreland back on the program, and we will be talking about his new book. And that's why we are so excited this hour to talk about this book that's been out for a little bit of time by Dr. Craig Keener. It is Miracles Today, Supernatural Work of God in the Modern World. Some of you that are familiar with his academic work might know that he wrote that, I think it's about 1,100-page Miracles, the Credibility of the New Testament Accounts many years ago, received all sorts of awards, including one from Christianity Today. And he is an individual that we have quoted from many times. Matter of fact, I think we mentioned him when we had Lee Strobel with us, but has his PhD from Duke University, professor of biblical studies at Asbury Theological Seminary. He has been the president of the Evangelical Theological Society, author of 33 different books with more than 1 million copies in print, and of course things like the IV Bible background commentary. If you'd like to read one about romance, fascinating book. Impossible Love came out a number of years ago about his marriage to an individual that was a refugee from her home country, which we might get into later if we have time. But this whole idea of miracles is kind of in the news. And so if nothing else, Dr. Craig Keener, it is great to have you back on the program.
It's great to be with you, Kerby. And I also do recommend Lee Strobel's and JP's books also on the subject.
Might just mention that they all have endorsed your book too, as well as very good comments from Gary Habermas and all sorts, and Stephen Evans and all sorts of other people have had on the program as well. So, in some respects, you had to go through a little bit of soul searching because, in some respects, you said, "Well, Lee Strobel has done this book and he interviewed me on it, and I've already written this kind of academic book. So, what's the point?" And yet, I think it was an opportunity that came from the Carl F.H. Henry Center for Theological Understanding to give you kind of a grant to put this together. And I think we are indebted to you for putting together this 280-page book that really kind of encapsulates some of what you wrote in the past, but just is chock full of all sorts of stories here in the 21st century.
Yes, I wanted to have something that wasn't exclusively academic like my first one was. And also, there were so many people who were citing the first one for different kinds of arguments, and yet I could tell by the way they cited it, they hadn't actually read it. And then I finally realized, 1,100 pages is kind of a tall order to ask people to read. So I wanted to do this, but I didn't want to punish the people that already read the big one, so I went ahead and like 70% of the material is just new material.
Well, again, it's so good because what you've done is really make the case for miracles. And I remember the first time I was actually required to edit a book on miracles. I just finished editing a book by Norm Geisler on Roots of Evil, and I edited his book on miracles and modern thought, and exposed me to some of the arguments of David Hume and some of those. But then what I love about this is, like J.P. Moreland and even Lee Strobel, you tell us some stories. But I guess the first thing we need to do is define the word miracle, because some people talk about the miracle New York Mets in 1969 winning the World Series, but that's not exactly what we're talking about, right?
Right. As Christians, we believe that God is at work all through nature. I mean, we see God's work all around us. I mean, you can't get much more miraculous in that sense than DNA. But what we have, when we speak of miracles more specifically, we're speaking of what theologians call special divine action. So instead of it being just the way God works ordinarily, the way that he set up natural processes and so on, it's where God acts in a special way to get the attention of people who wouldn't recognize his work in other ways. That's a bit different than the way that David Hume defined miracles. David Hume, I think he was kind of cheating by playing on words. He defined miracles as violations of natural law, and then defined a natural law as that which can't be violated, and said, see, you can't have miracles.
Yeah, and again, I think it's kind of interesting because he would say that anything that was unusual or unexpected or certainly improbable is a violation of natural law. Well, if you know anything about two particular gametes coming together to create even David Hume, that's pretty unusual. Or if, since I used the baseball analogy, we have stories of individuals who are actually able in the stands to have caught two successive home run balls. Now, the probability that you would catch one in a typical game is pretty high. The chances that you would catch two in a row is off the charts. But again, improbable things happen all the time, don't they?
Yes, that's true. Although the probability gets a lot higher when you're dealing with a pattern of God working in certain kinds of situations.
Let's, if we can, then maybe talk about just briefly, because I do want to get into some of the wonderful stories that you have here of why some people deny miracles. And part of that's worldview. Now, you would certainly recognize an atheist would deny miracles. But let's be honest, some of our Christian friends say, miracles happened in the first century, but they don't happen today in the 21st century. And you take some time to get into that as well. Can you help us out?
Sure. Yeah, when I was an atheist, which was many decades ago, I didn't believe miracles could happen. But then, well, after I met God, it was like, oh, yes, I was wrong. Miracles do happen. But in terms of whether miracles happen today or not, most people who believe that, say, certain spiritual gifts have ceased, and I'm not one of them, but I have plenty of friends who do believe that, they wouldn't say that God doesn't do miracles anymore. They would say God is sovereign. God can do whatever God wants to do. But for those who would say that miracles don't happen today, that they just used to happen, and sometimes I think this isn't so much a belief as just kind of a default. Well, we haven't seen any, so maybe they don't happen today. First of all, there's no biblical reason to believe that God works any differently today than he did through the rest of history up until the Bible was completed. And secondly, we just have so much evidence for God continuing to work through history.
Well, and again, let me take a break, but before we're done, we're going to also try to answer that again. Why don't we see more miracles in the West? Because a lot of these, as you will see, happen elsewhere. So before we're all through, there are 7 parts to this book. I'm going to try to do it justice. And again, trying to cover up book of 280 pages in an hour? Well, we'll do our best. But we're going to come back and talk about what about those who have witnessed those miracles? Are they credible witnesses? And we need to get into some of the aspects of that as well. We are privileged to have with us today Dr. Craig Keener, one of the books on miracles that we will be talking about. This one called Miracles Today. It is very easy to find. We have information about him, about the book, even links to his website, Facebook page, and Twitter. All of it available on our website, pointofview.net.
audible.net. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
More than a decade ago, Vanderbilt University issued an ultimatum to religious student groups that they must affirm the students' non-discrimination policy. The Christian group on campus believed that the leaders should share the religious beliefs and values of the religious organization. So David French, who was a religious liberties litigator at the time, wanted to help the organization. But the leader, Tish Harrison Warren, felt that a Christian conservative lawyer like him, who was also an Iraq War veteran, was the wrong person to make the case. Instead, she concluded that she was an acceptable kind of evangelical. She wasn't a fundamentalist and liberal in many of her views. Well, she found out how wrong she was. In her article, in Christianity Today, she realized that inside the church, the territory between, say, conservative Christians and more liberal Christians seems vast. But she found out that subscribers to broad Christian orthodoxy occupy the same square foot of cultural space. Why do I tell the story? I found that many young Christians think that if they are just liberal enough, the world will accept them. They tell themselves they aren't like those other Christians, they're the right kind of Christians. As I often say on radio, you never can be woke enough. Just consider the plight of so many liberals who are currently being criticized by the left. There is British author J.K. Rowling. There is George Washington law professor Jonathan Turley. There are comedians like Bill Maher and David Chappelle. Leftist critics scorn and ridicule upon them and post lots of angry tweets directed at them. I believe these young people are fooling themselves by thinking that they would be accepted for being the right kind of Christian. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And once again, Dr. Craig Keener with us today as we're talking about his book, Miracles Today. It is published by Baker. You can find it in your local bookstore perhaps, but we have a link to it. First of all, we have a link to the book so you can get a copy of that. We also have a link so that you can listen to it on audiobook or get it in Kindle. So we just have all sorts of resources there. Again, we have a link to his website, also a link to his Facebook page and Twitter page, and perhaps you would want to communicate with him. As a matter of fact, when that other book came out, he began to have all sorts of stories coming in, and certainly I think this will be a source of encouragement. But Craig, let's, if we can, talk about the second segment of your book, Witnesses of Miracles. Are there many witnesses of miracles? And there's two issues. More witnesses make the credibility more likely, and the credibility of individual witnesses do as well, because sometimes the argument is, well, these were uneducated people, or these were just Christians who were maybe predisposed. But what have you found in your research?
Yeah, that's one of the issues that Hume brought up. He said, well, we don't have any credible eyewitnesses for miracles, which I don't think is an argument that Hume himself would try to make today. There was a 2006 Pew Forum survey, and in just 10 countries, studying just Pentecostals and Charismatics in those countries, it came up with somewhere around 200 million people who claimed to have witnessed divine healing. And then as a control group, it had other Christians, and somewhere around 39% of them claimed to have witnessed or experienced divine healing. So of those who didn't claim to be Pentecostal or charismatic, but were Christians, they claimed, it's over 1/3 claimed to have witnessed those. And as well, I mean, in some countries where they weren't among the 10 countries, it's like in China, there was an estimate of maybe half of all conversions in the 20 years before the turn of the century were due to what the study called faith healing experiences. Dr. Balkrishna Sharma in Nepal said about 80% of the converts in Nepal are due to healings or deliverances. The important thing about those statistics is that these are not people who started with Christian presuppositions. These are people who actually abandoned centuries of their previous beliefs because of being confronted by Christian healing. And so, those statistics are pretty important. In terms of individual cases, I mean, we do have a lot of people who meet Hume's criteria for credible witnesses in terms of being highly educated with something to lose if they're lying and so on. And actually, a lot of times speaking against the grain of the culture to testify of these things.
And I think, again, I need to just remind people of Logic 101. There are examples, for example, of people who said they've had out-of-body experiences and later on turned out to be fallacious. That doesn't mean there aren't out-of-body experiences. There are certainly fake faith healers and healing ministries that sometimes have been discredited, but that doesn't mean there isn't true healing. And back to your point, I mean, you mentioned one survey that shows, nearly 3/4 of doctors just in the United States believe in miracles. Now, they are probably predisposed more than any other group to look for ordinary causes, maybe given sometimes the arrogance of a few doctors to think they brought about the particular change, and that this was nothing more than a remission of cancer or something like that. And yet you find pretty well-educated individuals doing that. And back to the issue of healing, that also, I appreciate about your book. You take us to, for example, an Oxford University Press book, Healing in the History of Christianity, because the arguments that some make is, well, you had healing in the first century. We don't have much healing at all until all of a sudden charismatics started saying that they saw some healing maybe in the late 19th century, early 20th century. But historically, we have these kinds of healing stories that go all through the ages, don't they?
Yes, exactly. And a lot of times they were responsible, again, for people converting. I mean, for abandoning other gods, for abandoning centuries of traditional ways of worshiping those gods. So in the 300s, Ramsay MacMullen, a professor emeritus of history at Yale University, concluded that in the 300s, the main cause of conversion to Christianity was healing and exorcism. It was also a big issue during the early 20th century Korean revivals. You find it in the Wesleyan revival and some other revivals as well. And yeah, again, throughout history.
Let's McCann, I'm just going to keep moving because you've got 7 parts, and part 3 is helpful because you have a whole section here on videos and doctors' reports. That's something new, Craig, because we've had those stories in the past, but you can't obviously reconstruct the past. That's more difficult. You're dependent on eyewitness testimony, and eyewitness testimony can be credible, but you have a lot more questions. But when you have a video report, you then have a contemporaneous report that people can watch again and again. And so you have a whole section here talking about videos and doctors' reports. Can you share some of that with us?
Sure. One of the cases was of Delia Knox, and everybody, her videos are easy to find because for 22 years she was singing from a wheelchair because she'd been injured in an automobile accident. She couldn't feel her legs. She couldn't feel anything from the waist down. And one time at a service where people were praying, she suddenly felt healing come back to her legs. Now, initially, as she began to walk in the video is there. Initially, as she began to walk, she was walking with a lot of difficulty because her muscles were atrophied. But, a month later, after she's had time to exercise and begin using those muscles again, she's walking normally. That's after 22 years of being in a wheelchair. In terms of doctors' reports, like you said, doctors, their job is to look for naturalistic explanations, and so that's not wrong for them to do that. That's what they're supposed to do. But sometimes there are things that just can't fit any of those. Another case of that is Barbara Comiskey-Snyder, who was dying a severe case of multiple sclerosis. 15 years, she'd spent like half of that in the hospital. But when she was sent home the last time she was supposed to die, somebody called in a prayer request to Moody Bible Radio, and there were just so many people who prayed for her. And suddenly, as she was on what would have been her deathbed, she heard a voice saying, "My child, rise up and walk." She wasn't able to walk. She couldn't even move her diaphragm. She was so paralyzed with her muscles. But suddenly she sprang out of bed, feet flat on the floor. In her case, the healing was so complete that her muscles weren't even atrophied. She was running around the house. She had to pull out the tubes, but she was running around the house. And all three of her doctors have written about this. I've interviewed a couple of them, and all of them agree that this was a miracle. And we mentioned earlier, like 3/4 of doctors in the U.S. Believe in miracles. Well, over half of them, even again with this a narrower definition of what a miracle is, over half of the doctors claim that they have witnessed miracles.
Wow. We need to take a break, and I might just mention, I think that last story was also in the Lee Strobel book, but let's come back and get into a couple of other issues, because this is something that goes back to your previous book, because we read about in the book of Matthew and also in Luke's gospel, the blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear. Whole section of examples in the 21st or 20th and 21st century in which that takes place. And then even more sometimes controversial, the dead are raised. You see that in Matthew 11:5 and Luke 7:22. Do we have examples of dead being raised? And then, of course, other examples of miracles, and even those. And then we'll get into, what about this? Is healing temporary? What happens when miracles don't happen, which is a really important question to ask. And why don't we see more miracles in the West, and a number of other things? It's just a fascinating book, and it is not only full of great theology and philosophy, but great stories and anecdotes as well. So if you find yourself saying, I got to get a copy of that book, we've made it very easy for you to perhaps find in your local bookstore. But if not, we have links to the book and even the audiobook. So it's available on our website at pointofview.net. And of course, we also have a link to Craig Keener's book website as well. It's craigkeener.com. And you don't have to remember all that, because it's all available at our website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll get into some of these things that we read about in the first century. They're happening in our century. We'll talk about that right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again as we continue our conversation today with Dr. Craig Keener. We have information about the book, about the audiobook, about his website, his Facebook post, and his Twitter feeds. All of that available on our website, pointofview.net. The book is entitled Miracles Today. It is published by Baker. Look for it in your local bookstore, but we've made it very easy for you to get a copy of it as well. And one of the things, Craig, that I talk about when we do apologetics, because we do a lot of apologetics kinds of things on this program, is obviously we point to the resurrection and we point to messianic prophecy fulfilled in the life of Christ. But another aspect, which I think most of us in the 20th and 21st century avoid, is the issue of miracles. But Jesus didn't. When indeed people were questioning him, he says what? Well, the blind receive sight, the disabled walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor are receiving the good news. And you see that in Matthew 11 and Luke 7. And it brings me back to your previous book, because one of the points you were trying to make, and I think you do it very well both in the earlier book and in this, is we do have contemporary examples of blind people actually being able to receive their sight, of disabled people being able to walk, of lepers being cleansed, and even deaf people hearing. That would make sense, but again, that's one of the reasons why you wrote the previous book and this one, just to give people some stories and some anecdotes, some cases vignettes about that. Can you kind of walk us through some of that, because they are really encouraging kind of stories?
Sure. There's one case where a woman had been blind for 12 years, and her husband, they never, they weren't in circles where people really prayed for healing. He was just desperate, and one night he just prayed that God would heal her, and suddenly she could see. And they have the before and after medical documentation. That was a few decades ago, and she remains sighted. And just to show how often these things can happen, I interviewed somebody else who was also blind for 12 years, in this case due to macular degeneration. I'm sorry, I think the previous one was due to macular degeneration. This one was due to diabetes, and somebody just prayed for her, and instantly she could see. And this happened in front of the whole church. And so we have lots of witnesses for that one. And in fact, her pastor tells me he keeps her old white cane in his office just as a memento kind of that. With in terms of deafness being healed, there's a book published some decades ago by Dr. Rex Gardner, MD, and he recounts a 12-year-old girl a 9-year-old girl, I'm still thinking 12, 9-year-old girl who was deaf without her hearing aid. She had just been tested by the audiologist. She had auditory nerve damage. She was instantly healed. The audiologist said it's impossible, but tested her again and found out, indeed, she had been completely healed. And then some of these things, they happen most often, especially the most dramatic things, in areas of groundbreaking evangelism where the gospel hasn't been preached yet. And so there are entire villages in northern Mozambique where they would go. There were no churches. Teams would go there. They would show the Jesus film. They would preach. And people spontaneously would start getting healed of deafness and sometimes blindness. And Southern Medical Journal actually published a study of this in September 2010 of one of the occasions where they did this, and found out that, yes, people went from being blind to seeing, from deaf to hearing. Naturally, there was a backlash on the internet about that, but one of the authors of the study, Candy Gupta Brown, professor at Indiana University, later published a book called Testing Prayer, published with Harvard University Press in 2012, and she has a chapter on that study and goes into great and I think very persuasive detail. But the result of that, they go into these villages, people who knew people there who were deaf, who were blind, and saw them, before they couldn't see, now they could see, before they couldn't hear, now they could hear. Entire villages would often be converted to faith in Christ through these things that were happening.
And again, we've seen that sometimes in history. We saw that, of course, even in the book of Acts. Let me mention real quickly that you have whole sections on, do disabled people still walk? Cerebral palsy, spinal injury, those kinds of stories. But I thought I might pick out one in terms of lepers being cleansed. Now, we don't have a lot of stories of leprosy, but one of your former students, if I believe, actually had an account that you share in, I think it's in chapter 22.
Yeah. I remember the account. I don't remember which chapter it was. But yeah, in terms of leprosy, well, I guess because of the part of the world in which I live, I don't encounter that many cases of leprosy. But this is one from India where one of my former students started working with a guy named Bari Malto. Now, before his conversion, Bari Malto had been a shaman, but he contracted leprosy. He was cast out of his village. And one day, a couple Christians came and prayed for him. Nothing happened right there on the spot, but that night, in a dream, an angel came and touched his hands. He woke up completely cleansed from leprosy, went back into the village. The entire village was converted. And by the time my friend and student, who was then my master's student, he's just finished his doctor's degree, but by the time he got there to work with him, about half the region had already been converted to Christianity.
And again, you can see that in some cases those were if you will, sign gifts, and those were used, I think, by the Lord to actually bring people to faith, because here's a shaman, couldn't heal himself, but then an angel does. So if we move on to the section on the dead are raised. These are always a little more controversial, but again, we have certainly the testimony not just of the early church, but also of the early church fathers during the medieval period. And then we even have some examples that come from certain parts of the world, don't we?
Yes. Around the year 180, you have Irenaeus talking about a church in France where people are often being raised from the dead. John Wesley gives an example of it in his own journal on the day it happened in 1742. And of course, today we have a number of examples. So one of the examples is from Sean George, who actually is a physician himself, and he's the example. So they spent like an hour and I think 55 minutes trying to revive him before they gave up, because after 6 minutes with no oxygen, irreparable brain damage has started in, but his colleagues were doing everything they could. But his wife prayed for him desperately. Suddenly, the heart monitor sprang to life, and they were like, boy, what can we do? He's, all his systems have shut down already, but, he's back to work now, and his colleagues, not all of whom are Christian, recognize this was a miracle. This one was in Australia. Dr. Chauncey Crandall gives an example from West Palm Beach. So this one's in the U.S., where he prayed for Jeff Markin, who had been dead for 40 minutes, flatlined for 40 minutes. Dr. Crandall told me that Jeff Markin's extremities and face had already turned black from cyanosis.
Wow.
But he returned to life, no brain damage, came to faith in Christ. And then, in terms of testimony, my own sister-in-law was, according to my mother-in-law, and according to another witness that we consulted, she was not breathing for 3 hours when they prayed for her. She has no brain damage. She has a master's degree now. God is still doing things like this.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into a couple of other issues, probably focus most of our time and attention on kingdom mysteries. But let me just mention there's a whole section on nature miracles, which we probably won't have time to get into, but a fascinating area as well, because that can be involved in the fact that if you think about that, Jesus was also able to still storms, and you have some incredible examples there, multiplying food, all sorts of things of that nature. But but I did want to come back and focus on this last section, because what about this? Why don't we see more miracles in the West? And perhaps the biggest question, what about when miracles don't happen? I mean, we all have had individuals we've prayed for, and we've seen some that we've prayed for, and we see a miracle, which is pretty rare. And other times we pray, and the individual dies. So what about that? And what about some of those issues? And what does the Bible really say about this issue of non-healing? So it addresses all the issues, and when we come back, we'll even address some of the difficult issues theologically right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Craig Keener with us as we talk about his book, Miracles Today, published by Baker. Look for it in your local bookstore, but we also have information about it on our website at pointofview.net. The last section raises lots of questions. Maybe we'll only have time for two of those. But the first, why don't we see more miracles in the West? And Craig, one of the things I've found is, we see and hear of more examples of demon possession in third world countries than we do here in this country. We hear of more examples of miracles in third world countries, or especially among unreached people groups. In some respects, by even asking the question, I've sort of given this possible answer to that. But this is, I think, a question that some people ask. If indeed God is in the miracle business, why don't I see more of those miracles happening around me?
Well, it's important to keep in mind the U.S. is only about 6% of the world's population, so naturally we're going to have more miracle reports from the other 94% since it's larger. But I think there are also some other factors. One is my friends from Africa, my wife is from Africa, often remind me, you guys have medical technology. That's a gift from God. Sometimes all we have are miracles. We have to depend on them desperately. But I think another factor, too, is that God does miracles where they'll most be appreciated. I mean, God can answer prayer anywhere, but the more spectacular, dramatic things are where it will particularly get people's attention for the gospel, and especially for areas of groundbreaking evangelism. In terms of answering prayer, though, also, the Bible does talk about faith. It's not to say that everybody who has faith always gets healed, or that God never heals anybody without faith. I mean, like when Jesus stills the storm, his disciples, he says, "Where was your faith?" So it's not like he does things only where there's faith. But we do struggle, I think, with the legacy of Hume here in the West, where we will take something technically we should recognize that everything is God's work. When God works through natural causes, that's God's blessing too.
Sure.
But often we will just say, okay, well, if it can be explained some other way, we'll just explain it another way. And we often don't appreciate what God does. And so I think we're less receptive to it, and we're less apt to trust God for miracles because I guess our faith muscles are a bit weaker. In the Gospels, you often see faith expressed in desperation. Mm-hmm. And so I do think that there's, in some parts of the world, I think the church has maybe a lot more experience with looking to God for miracles.
I think that's well said. And again, a part of it is humility, part of it is desperation, and a variety of other things. And I've said before, we're going to discover someday on the other side of life in heaven that God was engaged in a lot more miracles than he was given credit for, especially here in the West. But you have a chapter here when miracles don't happen, and you start the story by talking about Nabil Qureshi. Now, we've known him because he's been in studio with us, and talk about an individual with great potential. Is with the Ravi Zacharias ministry at the time, and so gifted, and then has stage 4 stomach cancer. And if you think I've got an answer for why one friend goes to the cancer clinic and is for some reason healed and the other is not, why individuals with such great potential like him end up losing their life, I don't have an answer for it. But it's, again, one of those great puzzles that I'm not sure we can answer in a few minutes, but at least help us understand why we find ourselves with a situation where one person gets a cancer diagnosis and then is miraculously healed, and others go through years and years of pain and suffering, or individuals come through maybe various kinds of challenges medically, and others seem to be not even affected by it. Can you at least give us some pointers and some guidelines in that regard?
Yeah, pointers and guidelines, not explaining individual cases. I'm still heartbroken over Nabil, but yeah, I mean, when we speak of the natural course of events in nature, I mean, miracles are something that are extra natural. They're extraordinary, rather than the way God has set things up to work and the way this fallen world works. And you just read through the genealogies in Genesis, and it'll say, so-and-so, they got so-and-so, and then they died. And in every case, with the exception of Enoch, it says they died. And even somebody like Elisha, who was so full of God's power that when they threw a corpse in on top of his bones, the corpse resuscitated. In, I believe it's 2 Kings 13, it speaks of Elisha being sick of the sickness with which he died. Trophimus I left at Miletus sick, 2 Timothy 4. Epaphroditus was sick close to the point of death, but God had mercy on him, Philippians chapter 2. I mean, it's still part of the ordinary course of life when God doesn't do something different. And that helps us also as we look at the nature of the miracles, what the signs and wonders in the Gospels were for. So earlier you quoted Matthew 11:5 and Luke 7:22. And in those passages where Jesus talks about the blind seeing and the good news being preached to the poor, Jesus is evoking two passages from Isaiah. One of them is Isaiah 35, the other is Isaiah 61. And the context of these passages is talking about the time of restoration. God will make a new heavens and a new earth. And so the context of Jesus answering, saying these things, he's responding to John the Baptist, who's in prison. He's awaiting execution. And John is saying, are you the one to come, or should we look for somebody else? I know that the coming one is going to baptize in the Holy Spirit and fire. I haven't seen any fire yet. I just hear you're healing some people. Is this the kingdom? And Jesus sends back word from the book of Isaiah that this is really a foretaste of the kingdom, that some of the works of the kingdom, the blind seeing, the deaf hearing, and so on, are being done. And in that, he's saying that the miracles he does are signs of the kingdom. They're a foretaste of the kingdom. Same as in Matthew 12:28, Luke 11:20, when Jesus says, if I by the finger of God or the Spirit of God am casting out demons, the kingdom of God has come upon you. When God doesn't do a miracle all the time, we wouldn't call it a miracle if it happened all the time. But whenever God does a miracle for anybody, it's a gift to all of us, because it's a reminder to us that a time is coming when he's going to wipe away every tear from our eyes. There's going to be no more sickness. There's going to be no more death. And even in the midst of this world, he's offering us signs to remind us that he hasn't forgotten his promise of a world made new.
Very good. Again, the book is entitled Miracles Today. We also have a link to CraigKeener.com. There's some free resources. You can also sign up to get his newsletter. And I do commend the book to you and hope that this conversation has maybe encouraged you to pray for miracles and to trust God. So, Craig, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
It's great to be with you.
Well, again, that's all we have for today, but I hope that you will take the time to find out a little bit more about this book, Miracles Today, the Supernatural Work of God in the Modern World. I want to thank Andrew as our engineer, Steve as our producer, and look forward to seeing you next time right here on Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.